So for week 1, I had a illustration that I created based on a raccoon's movement. And my two variables I used were time and distance from the ground in feet to show how a raccoon's distance from the ground changed over time. So you can see the graph that I created, and I learned how to use a real-life scenario and interpret it with a graph. For week 2, we went outside and solved an equation with algebra tiles. So you can see I used blocks of different size and color to represent different steps and variables, and I learned how to use a visual method to solve an equation. For week 3, we didn't have a creative project, so I chose to represent this Desmos activity slide, where I had to arrange 3 points so that they followed both a linear and exponential pattern. So you can see my first 2 points here were linear, and then my third point over here, when connected, made the graph exponential. So in this, I learned that an exponential graph is not linear because there's no constant and consistent rate of change. And you can see that by the obvious curve that would be there if the points were connected with a line. For week 4, we also didn't have a creative project, so I included this piecewise equation that I made with a graph that was on a Google Doc. I did so by determining domain and range and plugging in numbers from there. And I learned to write a piecewise function using a graph and data that I can interpret from the graph. For 5, I created a linear inequality, plotted it in a graph, and then chose 3 points, one out of the shaded region, one in, and one on the line. And then I plugged in my x and y values, that's how I solved it, to see if the point was a solution or not. So you can see I included a point that was inside of the shaded region, I plugged it in, and then I found that it was a solution. So I learned how to tell if a point is a solution to an inequality by plugging it in to the inequality itself and graphing it. For week 6, I used my 2 questions, how many sports do you play and how many hours of sleep do you get? And I analyzed that data by creating, first of all, I generalized or got that data by asking it from my friends, and then I used a correlation coefficient and a graph to determine if they had a relationship or not. And I learned to use a data and a graph as well as generate a correlation coefficient to check the relationship of data. And for week 7, I had to create a system and solve it. So you can see my system of equations, and then I included solving it by plotting it to find the point of intersection on a graph, and then by elimination, you can see my process. So I learned to solve systems using 2 methods, elimination and substitution is not displayed here. And finally, for week 8, I generalized a real-life scenario and then created an equation from that word problem. I made a table from that equation and a graph. So I solved the scenario using medicine by creating a data table and then plotting it. I learned to write exponential functions using word problems. So as you can see, I used the amount of morphine in the IV given to a patient after 6 hours when the morphine decreases at a rate of 15% per hour, and my initial amount given was 400 milligrams. And then I solved it for how many would be left after 6 hours, and it was there in my table and then in my graph. Thank you.